Hi, everyone. As Neha mentioned, this is Danielle Jackson, and I am the CISO for Secure Auth and Core Security. Thank you again for taking this time to learn a little bit more about how you can prepare for GDPR. I see from our attendee list that we have presence from multiple countries all over the globe, and I think it really solidifies what a global impact GDPR has on many organizations. So I'd like to walk you through today how you can kind of prepare for GDPR, a brief overview of what GDPR is and why it would matter to you, and how IAM can help. So what is GDPR? In general, I think it's important for everyone to know that the General Data Protection Regulation goes into effect on May 25th, 2018. And I'm sure that date has all resonated with everyone, hearing it over and over again. As that date nears and approaches, it's important to understand what the regulation actually means and how it's going to be applied to you. So I think a couple of important takeaways on this date and what the regulation actually entails is that the GDPR starts to introduce some measures on how to mitigate risk, some requirements in order to do so, and really addressing exporting, managing, and handling of personal data outside of the EU. One key point that I can't stress enough is the importance of the definitions within the GDPR, specifically around personal data. This entire regulation is around data and data subjects. And you hear the word data even in the title of the regulation, so you know you're going to want to pay attention to it. Personal data is going to be something that organizations operating outside of the European Union are going to be wanting to pay very close attention to. This is going to open up the scope a lot broader and a lot wider than some organizations are historically used to. So in the GDPR, for those of you that have read all 11 chapters and 99 articles, there are some articles and some chapters that are pretty meaningful to security, especially in the space of identity and access management. I want to highlight a few of those areas. In chapters 1 through 3, again, I mentioned the definitions. You'll go through a couple of articles that identify the rights of data subjects, specifically around the right to be forgotten and the right of collection of information. The information needs to be accurate. The information needs to be communicated to the data subject that it's being collected on them. And that data subject has the right to access it and to correct it and to be forgotten if they don't want. So chapters 1 through 3 really are, I think, a great place to start. These articles really identify and highlight some of those key areas, especially around identity and access management of individuals. Chapter 4, I left this highlighted as an independent chapter. It is probably the most unique and specific. It's the one I, as a CISO, paid most attention to in all of GDPR, in all 11 chapters. It has the most articles that I've pulled from that I believe are really relevant, not only in security, but identity and access management. These articles are kind of highlighted here underneath Chapter 4 section, specifically around the processing of data. This is where I feel my responsibilities, my role as a CISO, to work with my organizations across my company and across the Secure Auth and Core on how IT and security, how my products can all come together to ensure that we are meeting the GDPR requirements. And of course, in chapters 6 through 11, there's a very special article, Article 84, which identifies the penalties that are going to be imposed to you if you don't follow these requirements. So as we move along, I've also started to note that while it's nice in theory that I'd have all of the answers to provide you with, and we have a one-stop shop, we don't. So I wanted to provide everyone with an opportunity to look at a couple of other reputable sources. I found that Gartner had published a really good starting point. Gartner recommends that organizations start in these 5 areas to break down GDPR and how you can help yourself and your organization comply with this requirement. I think a lot of organizations, and if you feel this way, you're definitely not alone, are a little overwhelmed by this regulation. It introduces and requires organizations to practice things and to take into consideration elements of data, elements of privacy that some organizations have not been exposed to and are not used to, and that are going to fall under scope of being required to comply with. So I want to provide a couple of action items on what and how Gartner suggests and recommends organizations to start with. So we're going to go through about 5 of them. The first one is for organizations to determine your role. I think this is really important that Gartner highlighted a representative to act as a contact point for the DPA, the Data Protection Authority, be identified. These are one of those items that I was mentioning some organizations may not have in place and aren't used to. Some organizations don't even know what the Data Protection Authority is, and now they're going to be required to communicate directly with them. I think it's important to kind of start in understanding your role with GDPR, how does it apply to you, but how your organization is going to help communicate both inside and outside of the European Union. The second step falls directly in line. Maybe that person, that point of contact is with the DPA is going to be your data protection officer. Data protection officer is kind of a unique role, definitely something that I have seen over the last year becoming more and more unique in organizations where the role has maybe moved from a shared role into an independent role on its own. If your organization isn't set up to have one person assigned specifically to this role, it may be that your CISO or that your general counsel or that your data privacy officer also becomes a data protection officer. The requirement does, for many, require you to appoint a data protection officer, and I think this is important as an organization interfaces with either customers or public entities, that you have somebody that understands how your data subjects are protected, how data is protected in the company, and how you meet and comply with GDPR requirements. I also think it's important to understand the next slide, especially working with, and this is something I do within my own organization, working with IT, working with general counsel, working with your product organizations. One of the requirements is that organizations need to demonstrate and have accountability for how their data and all their data they're collecting on individuals is being processed. The other point that I want to note in here is outside parties. You're responsible for your third-party vendors. You're responsible for how data that you're collecting on individuals is being sent and transferred out. So whatever protections you have in place, you also want to make sure that anybody accessing that data that's outside of your organization also has the appropriate controls in place. We have seen in the U.S. so many breaches happen as a result of third parties, and you would be responsible for that breach. It's your third party. So you want to make sure that the accountability in all of the processing and all of the data transfer really falls into that scope of how you're going to handle and manage committing to protecting an individual's rights. One of the last pieces that Gartner recommends is following suit to understanding how your data is flowing. Data transfers to any of the 28 EU member states are still going to be allowed, and there are about 11 other countries that have adequate level of protection as deemed by the European Commission. Outside of that, and depending on how that information is transferred, everyone else starts to fall into scope. Anyone outside of those organizations processing personal data on any EU resident needs to ensure that they have compliance with GDPR as well. As I mentioned earlier, there's so many attendees on this call outside of the European Union that will fall into this scope and where they have to understand that GDPR actually applies to them. Last but not least, Gartner recommends that you start to understand what your data subject rights are. I mentioned earlier on in the definitions that personal data starts to expand. The scope, the definition of personal data starts to expand as well. Data subjects have extended rights under GDPR. This includes the right to be forgotten. A few years ago, this case had global impact, and I believe started with a European Union citizen that wanted to have his information unidentified by any search. The case ultimately, and I believe it's referenced at the bottom left if you guys wanted to read a U.S. News article, ultimately led into a lot of different regulations and requirements for personal data impacting an individual's privacy, specifically around the ability to be forgotten or the right to be forgotten if searched. This is something that carried over into this regulation that I think stumps a lot of organizations because data is in everything. An IP address is considered personal data. So how would you then look at all of these elements of personal data and ensure that if a data subject requests the right to be forgotten in the organization, that you can with certainty ensure that they have been completely forgotten within your organization. I am going to walk through a couple of key features and elements in a few moments on how Secure Auth can help. I do, before I start going down that road, want to identify a couple of important notes, and it's always nice to understand what you're kind of working with for both compliance and regulatory requirements, especially when fines are imposed. So I have some numbers here. They're very shocking, and many organizations probably couldn't afford to pay them. These fines, if you are found out of compliance and at fault, could reach a maximum of 20 million euro. That is more than most companies will see, and it's definitely a very shocking and impacting number, which is so relevant in terms of how important it is for organizations to take this regulation seriously. So I don't want to leave you with all of these shocking and scaring numbers. I want to be able to provide to you some information on how we can actually help and what you can do. So I'm going to walk through a couple of articles. Some of these articles I identified in the beginning that are pretty relevant to security and especially into the space of IAM, specifically Articles 15 and 16. Within these articles, they kind of address overall the ability to access personal information, for data subjects to make corrections, and for organizations to be able to allow data subjects the ability to consent for them to collect their data. Secure Auth IDP can help by allowing data subjects to view and access and edit any personal information that is collected on them. Organizations have that right to control those requests, so you can filter it through your help desk, you can allow data subjects to correct it on their own. We have the ability to adapt into so many different types of environments to allow you to enable or set up or establish different groups and different users that have those capabilities to allow your organization to see and understand what fits best for you within GDPR. The next set of articles really addresses that right to be forgotten. It's one that I've paid most attention to, along with the definitions and, of course, the fines in this regulation. It's the one that I've helped communicate across the board to all of my organizations, especially in IT and product, in building and understanding and developing how the data is going to be transferred. Because if you understand how that data transfer and that data flows, you really understand where your data subject is going to pass through and where that information is going to be collected. So that if you need to go back through it and you need to understand each and every point that data has been collected on an individual so that you can go through and delete it, it really helps to understand the data flow and the data process so that that individual requesting your organization, or in this case, my organization, to be forgotten, I can say with certainty that I have. One of those ways is we at Secure Auth and Core are consumers of Secure Auth IDP. We have a unified location or source of data that we use from our data store. I can also use those logs that I get from IDP to understand every access point of an individual so that I know when a user has logged in, I know where the user has accessed or has access to certain applications. That way, if a user no longer is in my organization, or that user has said, I'm leaving your organization and I don't want you to have any trace or trail of where I have been, you can completely forget that. And I can say with certainty that their IP address, that their name, that their username, and any additional information I've collected on them can be deleted. Articles 25 and 32 also start to help with the design and the implementation within your security. Specifically in these articles, there is a requirement that designs must be made in an organization to protect and secure personal data. And in those articles, it goes on to suggest, and at some points require, that personal data and security be based on risk. This excited me when I read it, as I know as a consumer myself of our own Secure Auth IDP product, that I can start to layer risk checks. I know that our adaptive access will help the misuse of any credential that I have in my environment. And we do that by evolving our adaptive access platform to stay ahead of our threats. We're able to detect anomalies, we're able to protect access, and we can challenge users when risk is there. We have, and the screen demonstrates our layers of risk checks. And if you go onto our website, there's demos and there's layers of risks that we walk through in each of our products to go through authenticating a user to identify whether or not that user is who they say they are, that their credentials are actually valid and they haven't been misused, stolen, or lost in any way. I think this helps organizations manage and balance security and usability. We can allow risk checks to run in the background and allow the user to seamlessly and effortlessly access any of their applications. It really allows for a frictionless experience without sacrificing security. So when I read that we needed to have a risk-based approach to user and user security, it was almost a no-brainer for us in our environment that this was something we could easily achieve and meet compliance with in GDPR. So I mentioned seeing Secure Auth in action, specifically around our IDP product and offering a variety of security and authentication mechanisms for you to understand how your users are accessing your environment, what controls are in place, how you can leverage our risk protection and risk layers to help your organizations meet the GDPR requirements. So if you would like to request a demo, we've got a page set up. There's a link at the bottom. You can always look at our website and start to understand even a little bit more before somebody comes in on the different layers, the different risk approach that we take. I'm able to answer any questions you guys have as well. I'm happy to redirect and to get somebody out in person. Unfortunately, I am only one individual, so I can't be on everyone's site as much as I'd love to be, but we are a great team and happy to help answer any questions in person that you guys may have as well. So I would like to thank you all for your time. I know you've got about 5 to 7 minutes back in your calendars, and I look forward to any other questions or follow-ups that you may have. Thank you all so much for attending.